June 1942, 10:30 hours, a jungle ravine on the Kokoda Track, Papua. The air was heavy, humid, and charged with the metallic tang of fear and stale gunpowder. Private Kevin "Kev" O'Connell, an Australian infantryman with a beard of 3 days' growth, lay prone in the thick, unforgiving mud, his breath ragged and coming in short, panicked gasps. He was pinned down by a Japanese light machine gun, its harsh, rhythmic chatter echoing through the dense, dripping jungle foliage, a sound that, in this environment, often signaled doom. Kev desperately gripped his weapon, a standard-issue American Thompson submachine gun. The Thompson, famous for its gangster-era image and powerful .45 caliber round, was a fearsome weapon, a psychological deterrent, capable of unleashing a torrent of close-range fire. However, here, in the relentless corrosive mud and moisture of the Papuan jungle, Kev's Thompson had gone silent. A tiny piece of debris, mud, grit, rotted vegetation, or perhaps a fragment of a leaf, had been forced into the action, jamming the complex mechanism. He was carrying a 6-pound piece of useless, expensive metal. Kev knew the brutal reality of the enemy's discipline. When the Allied firing stopped, the countercharge began. He frantically tried to clear the jam, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm that drowned out the sounds of the jungle. The failure of his weapon was the difference between survival and death, a logistical reality that cost thousands of Allied lives in the early, brutal days of the Pacific War. The mud of the jungle, it turned out, was a more effective and insidious enemy than the Japanese infantry itself. The problem wasn't a lack of firepower, it was a catastrophic lack of reliability. Standard submachine guns like the Thompson or the British Steen were fundamentally ill-suited for the tropical environment. They were designed for the drier, cleaner battlefields of Europe or the open spaces of the desert. Their delicate mechanisms, relying on narrow internal tolerances, spring-loaded side-mounted magazines, and exposed ejection ports, were catastrophically vulnerable to the fine, abrasive mud and relentless humidity of the jungle. A single speck of grit entering the action could render the weapon inoperable, turning a moment of desperate defense into certain annihilation. The high rate of weapon malfunction was a hidden epidemic, undermining the courage of the infantryman at the exact moment he needed his weapon most. Thousands of miles away, back in the relatively peaceful Australian mainland years earlier, an eccentric young inventor named Evelyn Owen had already identified this fundamental design flaw. Owen was not a professional engineer, nor a career military man. He was a 24-year-old sawmiller from the tiny coastal town of Wollongong, south of Sydney, driven by an almost obsessive idea, building a simple, reliable machine gun that could operate under the harshest Australian conditions. Owen's workshop was his backyard shed. His tools were basic, his budget was non-existent. Yet, in 1939, using rudimentary parts, a homemade lathe, and sheer self-taught ingenuity, Owen produced his first prototype. His design was radical, unconventional, and, to the eye of the military expert, exceptionally ugly. It looked crude, cobbled together from common metal tubing, and fundamentally wrong, according to the existing military doctrine which prioritized sleek lines and complexity. Owen immediately presented his invention to the Australian Army Ordnance officers. The reception was dismissive, bordering on outright ridicule. The officers, steeped in the formal, conservative traditions of British military design, laughed openly at the backyard contraption. It was heavy, its finish was rough, and its most defining feature, the top-mounted magazine, was instantly rejected as an unnecessary novelty that obstructed the line of sight. They questioned his authority, his experience, and his credentials. The army was committed to licensing and producing weapons of established foreign design, like the Sten and the Thompson. They did not need a piece of amateur rubbish from an unknown sawmiller. Owen was sent home, his prototype weapon relegated to a dusty storeroom, his genius dismissed as youthful arrogance. The rejection was a crushing blow, compounded by the official disinterest. Owen even enlisted as a private in the AIF, hoping to convince them from within the military structure, but his pleas were ignored. His idea languished, ignored by a bureaucracy focused on adopting established, but ultimately flawed, foreign designs. However, the subsequent Japanese invasion of the Pacific and the harsh, immediate lessons learned on the Kokoda Track, where Kev O'Connell's Thompson lay silent, would soon brutally prove the crude sawmiller's genius. The jungle had no respect for military doctrine or sophisticated mechanisms. The very features the army had laughed at, the top-mounted magazine and the simple, oversized bottom-ejection port, were about to become the essential ingredients for survival in the relentless mud of Papua. The initial dismissal of Evelyn Owen's backyard gun would soon be recognized as one of the most critical logistical and tactical blunders of the Pacific Campaign, a mistake that would have to be rectified under the most desperate and fatal conditions. Late 1942, the Ordnance Testing Ground, Victoria, Australia, the grim reality of the Kokoda Track had finally forced the Australian Army's hand. The reports flooding back from Papua were catastrophic. Weapons were failing at an unacceptable rate. The relentless mud, the humidity, and the fine, abrasive jungle grit were rendering the sophisticated mechanisms of the American Thompson and the British Steen guns useless. Lives were being lost not to enemy fire, but to simple weapon malfunction. The urgent, desperate need for a reliable jungle weapon resurrected the memory of Evelyn Owen's peculiar, ugly, yet fundamentally simple design. The Ordnance Board, facing political pressure and military necessity, reluctantly retrieved the backyard contraption from storage for a formal, comprehensive trial. This was to be the ultimate test of reliability, the trial by mud. The Australian Army devised a brutal, highly practical testing regime specifically tailored to mimic the worst conditions of the Papuan jungle. The test required the weapons, the Owen, the Thompson, the Sten, and others, to be deliberately fouled with mud, sand, and water, then immediately fired. The results were immediate and devastatingly clear. The expensive, internationally acclaimed weapons failed almost instantly. The Thompson, with its tight internal tolerances and small side-mounted ejection port, jammed after a single exposure to mud. The Sten, despite its simplicity, frequently failed to cycle rounds due to debris entering its magazine well and operating parts. They were rendered useless. Then came the Owen gun. The moment Evelyn Owen's design was subjected to the same fouling, its revolutionary simplicity shone through. The top-mounted magazine, which the ordnance officers had laughed at as crude, proved to be a brilliant engineering solution. By positioning the magazine vertically, any fine grit or mud that entered the mechanism was pulled downward by gravity, away from the bolt in the firing chamber. Furthermore, the separate past a massive bottom ejection port was the game changer. Spent casings and fouling could be ejected straight out through the large, unobstructed opening at the bottom of the gun's receiver. There was no narrow gap for debris to get caught. The gun essentially self-cleaned with every shot. The Owen gun, fired immediately after being buried in thick, viscous mud, cycled perfectly. It fired when the others failed. It fired when it was dripping wet. It fired when it was coated in sand. The backyard contraption proved to be the most reliable submachine gun ever tested under these extreme, battlefield-specific conditions. The crude design was, in fact, an elegant, practical masterpiece forged by necessity. The Ordnance Board, now facing the undeniable evidence, issued an unprecedented recommendation. The Owen gun must be rushed into immediate mass production. Evelyn Owen, the sawmiller, was suddenly transformed from a ridiculed amateur into a national asset. The design featured a key innovation that further simplified maintenance. The barrel could be instantly removed with a twist and a latch, allowing a soldier to clear a deep jam or swap a damaged barrel without complex tools, a vital capability when facing a Japanese countercharge deep in the jungle. The decision to adopt the Owen gun was a radical departure for the Australian Army, forcing them to prioritise homegrown, practical innovation over deference to British or American designs. It was a victory of the Australian diggers' pragmatic spirit over military bureaucracy. However, the rapid transition to production faced intense challenges. The design was unorthodox, requiring new tooling and manufacturing processes, but the urgency of the Kokoda crisis ensured that these challenges were met with the same resourceful intensity that characterized the Australian soldiers themselves. The first production models of the Owen gun were rushed directly from the factory floor to the supply lines heading for Papua, ready to meet the Japanese where their traditional weapons were failing. The reliability of the Owen gun was soon measured not in laboratory tests, but in lives saved on the front lines. Soldiers like Private Kev O'Connell would soon trade their jamming Thompsons for the ugly, top-heavy, and utterly dependable Owen gun, a weapon that became the single most prized piece of equipment for any man fighting in the unforgiving crucible of the Papuan jungle. The trial by mud had ended. The trial by fire was about to begin. 1943, the height of the New Guinea campaign, the Owen gun dominates the jungle. The ultimate validation for Evelyn Owen's backyard design was not found in the clean results of the testing grounds, but in the brutal, unrelenting crucible of the New Guinea campaign. The Australian troops, fighting through the mud, steep terrain, and relentless rain of the Kokoda Track, quickly transformed their skepticism about the peculiar weapon into absolute, life-saving trust. The Owen Submachine Gun earned its legend through sheer, unparalleled reliability, unlike its American and British counterparts, which were fragile machines designed for clean fighting and requiring meticulous maintenance. The Owen was built like a rugged, simple tool for the worst conditions on Earth. It was an engineering philosophy that prioritized function over form, and the jungle rewarded that brutal honesty. For Private Kev O'Connell and his comrades, the gun's unique features were not flaws, but fundamental, life-saving attributes. The top-mounted, gravity-fed magazine was the genius centerpiece of the design. When the weapon was held, the magazine's vertical positioning meant that gravity was constantly aiding the feeding of the rounds. More importantly, any fine grit, abrasive mud, or water that inevitably fell onto the mechanism was pulled downward, away from the delicate bolt face and the firing chamber. This was the Achilles heel of side or bottom-fed weapons, which relied on tight tolerances and perfect alignment. The Owen simply shrugged off environmental contaminants. Furthermore, the separate, massive bottom ejection port was the other game-changer. Spent casings and fouling could be ejected straight out through the large, unobstructed opening at the bottom of the gun's receiver. There was no narrow gap for debris to get caught and jam the reciprocating bolt. The gun essentially self-cleaned with every single shot. The Thompson or the Sten had exposed mechanisms that trapped debris. The Owen's design actively expelled it. This feature alone saved countless lives. The difference in combat was stark, often measured in the few milliseconds it took a soldier to pull the trigger. In a close-quarters ambush, the dominant form of combat on the Kokoda Track, the ability to deliver an instant, sustained burst of automatic fire was the only insurance policy available. While the Japanese or even Allied soldiers with a steam gun might face a devastating jam after submerging their weapon in a creek crossing or dropping it into the perpetual mud, the Owen gun kept firing. Australian soldiers quickly developed an intense, almost devotional loyalty to the weapon. They would often submerge the Owen gun completely in the thick, viscous mud or the brackish water of a jungle creek, only to pull it out and fire a full burst immediately, a feat unthinkable with any other submachine gun of the era. This confidence was priceless. A soldier's certainty that his weapon would fire when his life depended on it was the single greatest psychological advantage he could carry. It removed the paralyzing fear of weapon malfunction during the most critical moments of combat. The Owen gun was not aesthetically pleasing. Its unusual, top-heavy appearance and the offset sight required unique training, but its reputation for reliability spread like wildfire among the infantry. Soldiers often went to great lengths to acquire an Owen, frequently discarding their Thompsons or Stens, weapons that were far more established and respected by headquarters, for the ugly but utterly dependable Australian design. This was the ultimate battlefield testimonial. The infantryman's choice, made under the duress of combat, always favoured the weapon that worked. The gun's success was ultimately a quiet victory for Australian ingenuity and pragmatism. It was a testament to the fact that brilliant engineering does not always require high-tech materials or sleek design. Sometimes, the most effective solution is the one that best understands and respects the brutal reality of the environment it must operate in. The backyard gun had become the absolute monarch of the Papuan jungle. The Owen gun completely redefined jungle warfare tactics for the Australians. Because they could rely on their short-range automatic fire, Australian units became masters of the short, savage, close-quarters counter-ambush. When attacked by the Japanese, the Australian ability to respond immediately with a sustained burst of fire, regardless of the water and mud, gave them a terrifying advantage. The Japanese, whose own Arisaka rifles were reliable but slow, relied heavily on their bayonet charges following an ambush. The Owen gun effectively neutralized this tactic by delivering overwhelming, sustained close-range fire, stopping the charge before it could gain momentum. The design's simplicity made it easy to maintain in the primitive conditions of the jungle. Its field stripping process was intuitive, and the quick change barrel, removed with a simple twist, allowed soldiers to clear rare blockages or perform essential cleaning in seconds, without requiring a workbench or specialized tools. This was crucial on the Kokoda Track, where weeks could pass without access to a proper base. The ability for a soldier to perform full maintenance on his weapon using just a small coin and his bare hands meant less time exposed to the elements and the enemy. The psychological dimension of the Owen gun's reliability was perhaps its greatest asset. The Australian digger, facing a fanatical enemy in a terrain designed to break both body and spirit, needed to know that one constant remained true. That constant was the crude, top-heavy weapon he carried. It was a physical manifestation of defiance against the conditions. It empowered the Australian soldier to fight aggressively, knowing his weapon would not fail him when he was deep in enemy territory, miles from support. The story of the Owen gun is a powerful narrative of how a single, simple engineering solution, initially ridiculed, saved an entire campaign. Evelyn Owen's dedication, initially dismissed by the bureaucracy, was ultimately validated by the thousands of Australian lives saved in the mud. The weapon was ugly, it was rough, but it was reliable, and in the unforgiving hell of the Kokoda Track, reliability was the definition of kingship. Post-war era, 1945 and beyond. The aftermath of the Pacific. The Owen Submachine Gun ceased mass production shortly after the conclusion of World War II, but its reputation as the king of the jungle was forever cemented in the annals of military history. The backyard contraption, initially ridiculed by the Australian Army's bureaucracy, had ultimately proven its worth by saving countless lives in the most brutal theatre of the war. The legacy of the Owen gun is threefold. It represents a triumph of pragmatic engineering, a critical moment for Australian industrial self-reliance, and a lasting symbol of the digger's preference for reliability over aesthetics. Firstly, the Owen gun became a legendary example of how simplicity and environmental respect trump complexity. The very features that made it look crude, the top-mounted magazine and the large, exposed bottom-ejection port, were the features that guaranteed its reliability in the mud and wet. This practical lesson resonated throughout post-war military design. Weapons built with minimal moving parts and wide tolerances for contamination are superior in extreme environments. The Owen's philosophy laid the conceptual groundwork for future reliable infantry weapons. Secondly, the Owen gun's adoption marked a crucial point for Australian industrial independence. The war forced Australia to quickly develop its own military manufacturing base. While relying on foreign designs like the Sten was a necessity, the Owen gun was a purely Australian invention, designed by an Australian, manufactured by Australians, and proven effective in Australian-mandated combat zones. Its success provided immense national pride and competence, proving that local ingenuity could produce world-class military equipment. The reliability of the weapon was such that the Owen gun remained in service with the Australian forces for over 3 decades. Seeing action in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, its enduring service history is the ultimate testament to Evelyn Owen's genius. In Vietnam, where jungle conditions were equally brutal, the Owen continued to be a trusted, reliable weapon, a far cry from the fate of its more famous, but less reliable, contemporaries. The story of the Owen gun is a powerful narrative of redemption for its inventor. Evelyn Owen, after being dismissed by the army, was eventually compensated and recognized for his extraordinary contribution. His initial persistence, fueled by the conviction that his simple design was superior, was ultimately validated by the harsh reality of the battlefield. The weapon's success highlighted the dangers of bureaucratic conservatism and the necessity of listening to unconventional, yet brilliant, voices. The Owen gun, with its quirky appearance, remains a beloved icon for Australian veterans. It is the gun they trusted their lives to, the one that never failed in the close-quarters ambush, the one that guaranteed survival when the odds were stacked against them. It is more than just a piece of metal. It is a symbol of resourcefulness, stubbornness, and the ingenuity born from isolation. The ugly backyard gun became the beautiful lined, life-saving constant in the chaos of the jungle war. The successful journey from a Wollongong shed to the most dangerous places on Earth is a story that proves the most powerful innovations often come from those closest to the problem. not necessarily those with the largest budgets or the most impressive titles. If you're fascinated by the incredible story of Evelyn Owen and how his simple, backyard design defied military expectations to save countless lives, please subscribe now. Your support helps us uncover more pivotal, untold moments of Australian military history and the genius behind its iconic weapons. The lasting legacy of the Owen gun is its contribution to the digger's confidence and fighting spirit. The Australian soldier, fighting a fierce enemy in an unforgiving terrain, needed absolute certainty in his weapon. The Owen provided that certainty. It empowered the infantryman to fight aggressively, knowing his gun would cycle, clean itself, and fire under any conditions. This confidence was a strategic asset that contributed immeasurably to the overall success of the campaigns in New Guinea. Ultimately, the Owen gun's triumph over the mud and the skepticism of the High Command is a timeless military lesson. In warfare, reliability is the only currency that matters. The crude, top-heavy weapon was the champion of that ideal. What other ugly but effective weapon from Rokio do you think deserves more recognition for its reliability in extreme conditions? Share your favorite overlooked military innovation in the comments below.